I know it's very repetitive, but I try to get further into some of these issues, and sometimes it's convenient to use the same example over and over again. Um, so one issue that we can consider, which is more concrete, is how's it? So Zizek, in connection with Marxism, why is Marxism on one side and the, let's say, Christianity, especially according to the interpretations brought out in the uh, let's say I'm more familiar with the Catholic doctrine, so I'll say in Catholicism, although there's a lot of agreement, I think, with the Eastern tradition on a lot of on these issues of I don't I don't know the Eastern tradition on the question of free will, but or on original sin, let's say. So I one could see a divide more solidly in this Marxist tradition versus the Catholic tradition in this question, where on the Marxist side, there's clearly a demand for the so-called blind materialism, in the sense that because the beginning is seen not as the arising of original sin, so that certain questions um, arise, um, which I'll try to give a more concrete analysis of how this is thought in terms of from the Thomistic point of view of the four forms of law of Thomas. But from the Marxist point of view, you can see that there's an economic structure, which is a physical structure. So in Lewis Morgan, this notion that if you're in a sustenance um, sustenance human group um, prior to agricultural life, where you don't have any um, extra grain sitting around, it doesn't make sense to keep slaves. You might want slaves for some reason, for sex, for to boss people around, but to do your work for you or something. But you don't really have work. You don't really have a job. You're just you're hunter gatherers. Let's say there's nothing extra to. You might take captives. So I know the people that raise this issue that a lot of Native American tribes, or however you want to refer to them, kept captives. But these basically just became other members of the tribe, because you'd have to feed them somehow, and there's no extra food in those societies. So the economic structure, so the physical reality, the blind physical reality determines the social reality, is the point, the first point of Marxism. And the first moment when you get this situation where there's excess of grain, and then you can feed this slave population, for instance, and it makes sense to start having a higher hierarchy in your society based on this excess, physical excess. This is like the original sin, is analogous to original sin in Christian, in Catholic thinking. So you can see where if you have a tendency, so then there's the question, like, are the people that are attracted to this kind of explanation, this blind material explanation for social order, for political order, the superstructure versus the core, versus the superstructure and laws and social mores, as over and against the physical demands, the core physical demands, and the two being mutually determining one another in some way, which can be discussed at various levels of subtlety. This gives rise to a view. This is attracted to people of a certain bent. And is it that, I mean, it's a chicken or egg issue, but it seems like if you're already on this side of blind material view, you're going to be more attracted if you come to understand what Marx and Engels are talking about. That has a certain attraction because it's concrete, because you see that a change in the material conditions leads to a change in the social conditions and so on, and then you can have something to work with. So whereas on the other hand, and this is kind of so we can see that Zizek is favoring this view is leftist, right? So then on the other hand, we have this view that there's original sin, and I think that the example of the Cain story is very strong in the sense that here is really the origin of the logos coming in of somebody saying to themselves, "Am I my brother's keeper? I didn't know. Am I my brother's keeper?" Consciousness, the logos comes in, and then what Thomas is calling natural law, so that we had certain impulses, trieb or instinct, this vague word instinct, are at work, and then we modify them by discussing them. So, I mean, for instance, for example, that we have a drive to eat. We know when we're hungry. Common sense, in the most simple sense, tells us the cure to this feeling of hunger is to eat. But then you can have all kinds of discussions with the logos about what kind of diet. You can prescribe different kinds of diet. That diet can become part of as it is, it becomes part of the positive or human law. Human law, and Thomas termed positive law in the discussion of the contemporary jurists. Law that is laid down. You get nutrition guidelines, for instance, things like that. And those are specific interpretations of the natural law, which then, according to Thomas, would attempt to spell out the eternal law. So the eternal law, you can see what it means more simply with insects or animals. The spider follows the eternal law just by doing its technique or its art of, which isn't an art in the human sense, but an inborn technique of making webs, right? The spider just knows how to make webs. That's part of the eternal law, and there's no question of the spider modifying this instinct to make webs through a discussion, through giving reasons. Maybe it's better to make a web this way. Maybe it's better to make it that way. There's no discussion. So the question doesn't arise. It only arises when this moment of the "Am I my brother's keeper?" comes in, and the discussion begins. And then later on, it becomes with Platon, it becomes, and Socrates, many specific issues come in, such as raising the issue of the universal. With Socrates, the first to raise the issue of the universal, and then this issue of the, say, dialogic discussion in the Platonic sense, where you have this question of contradiction and all this, and maybe we can find out through posing certain rules the proper understanding of various instincts, supposing that justice is an instinct in some sense. Then there has to be a discussion about what diet, on analogy, to have with regard to justice. So you can see that this posits two different sides to the notion of an early break into how the problem of the laws is arising. The remoteness of which both questions are pushed back differs depending on how we look at it. Are we looking at an event that happened 50,000 years ago, 70,000 years ago? When did the first agriculture? So then you can look at when the first, and then on the Marxist side, you can look and see when did the so-called Aryans and the so-called Semites first become agricultural societies, first become hierarchical societies, change in their base physical characteristics, which produce different social characteristics. And so these are two big modes of analysis which can be superimposed over the human problem on the whole. And so I think that's a right left. So it's not right left in just the, obviously in the, you have to look at it, we'd have to look at it at every level. It's not obvious that it's, this is, we're talking about sort of right left in England or in American politics, but in some sense, is this can this be viewed as a right left issue, or what does right left mean here? But there's a break there, which I think is worth further consideration going forward.